You didn't start young. You watched other people ride for years, maybe decades. You told yourself the window had closed, that there was a version of your life where you did it, and that version wasn't this one. And then one day, at 43 or 51 or 62, you bought the bike anyway. What happened in that moment isn't what most people think it is. It isn't a crisis. It isn't recklessness finally winning, and it definitely isn't a last gasp at something you missed. It's one of the most psychologically deliberate things a human being can do. And the science behind why people do it late, specifically late, is far more interesting than anyone has bothered to explain. Here's what the world gets wrong. Society has a very specific story about people who take up motorcycles after 40. The story involves the word crisis. It involves a certain knowing look, a gentle suggestion that perhaps a therapist might be more appropriate than a Harley dealership. That story is not just wrong, it's the opposite of what the psychology actually shows. Starting something genuinely difficult, something with real stakes, a real learning curve, and a real possibility of failure later in life isn't a symptom of losing your grip on reality. It's a sign that you haven't lost your grip on yourself. There's something specific that happens to people in midlife that almost no one talks about honestly. The choices stop. Not all at once, slowly, quietly. The versions of yourself that were still possible, the ones that required open time, open identity, open risk, get closed off one by the accumulating weight of everything you've already decided to be: your career, your relationships, your reputation, your habits. Psychologists call this identity foreclosure, the gradual narrowing of who a person allows themselves to become. And research shows that by midlife, most adults have foreclosed on the vast majority of their possible selves, not because those selves were rejected, but because they were simply never revisited. The person who picks up motorcycles at 53 didn't suddenly go reckless. They did something far rarer. They reopened a door that most people quietly seal shut and spend the rest of their lives walking past. That's not a crisis. That's courage with a very specific psychological name. There's a man named Ray, 51 years old, from Denver, Colorado. He spent 26 years as a high school history teacher. Steady, reliable, respected. He built his entire identity around being the person who showed up, who kept things together, who never needed anything dramatic. For as long as he could remember, he had wanted to ride, not obsessively, just persistently, a quiet background frequency that never went away. At 50, he was diagnosed with early-stage hypertension. His doctor told him to reduce stress. His doctor meant yoga. Ray bought a motorcycle instead. The first 3 months were humbling in a way he hadn't expected. He dropped the bike in a parking lot. He stalled on a hill in front of other drivers. He spent 2 Saturdays in a course with people literally half his age, relearning how to trust his own hands. He almost quit. Twice. He didn't. And what happened in the months after he crossed through that wall of incompetence is something neuroscience has a specific explanation for. Learning a complex physical skill activates neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new neural connections at any age. A study from the APA found that learning multiple challenging new skills in older adults can, over time, produce cognitive test scores comparable to those of much younger adults. What's more, the research identifies novelty, challenge, and physical engagement as the 3 most powerful drivers of this process. Motorcycling hits all 3 simultaneously. Ray says the hypertension numbers improved. His doctor asked what he changed. Ray told him. His doctor didn't know what to say. But there's a force operating underneath the skill in the neuroscience, something that doesn't show up in brain scans but drives the decision more than anything else: regret. Not the regret of having done something, the other kind. Research on regret psychology has produced one of the most striking asymmetries in behavioral science. In the American Regret Project, 20-year-olds had roughly equal regrets about things they'd done and things they hadn't. But as people aged, that balance shifted dramatically. By age 50, regrets of inaction outnumbered regrets of action by 2 to 1. Age, the data showed, was the single strongest predictor of inaction regret. Here's why that matters for people who start writing late. The person who walks into a dealership at 55 isn't being impulsive. They're doing the math. They're calculating, consciously or not, that the cost of not doing it has finally, irrevocably exceeded the cost of doing it. That's not recklessness. That's one of the most rational decisions a human brain is capable of making. Now let's be honest about what can go wrong. For some people, starting late is an escape from something they haven't faced. A failing marriage, a career that stopped meaning anything, a self postponed so many times that novelty becomes the only thing that makes them feel real. The motorcycle becomes a prop in a story they're telling about who they still could be. Psychologists call this substitution, using a new identity marker to avoid the harder work of integrating the old one. The person in a healthy relationship with a late start gets humbled by the learning curve and leans into it. The person using it as escape resents it. They wanted the identity, the jacket, the image, more than the actual skill. One is transformation, the other is decoration. The healthiest late starters tend to be the slowest. They're after something the outside can't verify. There's a woman named Carol, 58 years old, from Nashville, Tennessee. She raised 3 children, ran a household, and worked part-time as a bookkeeper for most of her adult life. Not a small life, a full one. But for 30 years, every significant decision she made was made in service of someone else's need, or someone else's timeline. At 57, her youngest moved out. Her husband expected her to feel lost. She felt something else. She felt available. She had watched a woman on a motorcycle at a red light the previous spring. Not a young woman, a woman probably her age, in ordinary clothes, helmet under her arm, completely unhurried. Carol had thought about that image for months without fully understanding why. She signed up for the MSF beginner course the following January. She was the oldest person there by 12 years. She passed on the first attempt. What she describes afterward isn't adrenaline, it isn't rebellion, it's something quieter and harder to name. She says for the first time in decades, she was doing something where her entire history, her roles, her relationships, her reputation was completely irrelevant. On the bike, she was just a person trying to get it right. Nothing she had ever been before counted for anything, and nothing she had ever sacrificed for anyone was owed to her. Psychologists call this self-concept clarity, a stable, internally consistent sense of who you are that exists independently of your obligations. Research consistently shows that people who develop it later in life, often after the role-heavy years of raising families and building careers, report higher life satisfaction, better stress management, and stronger emotional resilience than people who never had the opportunity to find it. Carol isn't trying to be younger, she's trying to be more specifically herself. Those are not the same thing, and most people who've never done it can't feel the difference. So here's what the people watching from the outside never understand. Starting late isn't the consolation prize. It isn't what happens when you missed the real window. The person who buys the bike at 54 has something the 22-year-old never did. They know exactly what they're giving up to be there. They know what the alternative looks like. They've felt the specific weight of the years spent not doing it, and they chose it anyway, deliberately, eyes fully open, with the entire rearview mirror visible. There is a version of courage that only becomes available after a certain amount of living. It's quieter than the young kind. It doesn't need an audience. It has already made peace with looking foolish because it's been far more afraid of something else. The fear of arriving at the end of things and realizing the road was always there, you just kept finding reasons to stay in the car. If this hit something you've been sitting with, drop a comment below. How old were you when you started riding, and what finally made you do it? Tell us the real story. We actually want to know.